we will pick up our conversation on peers and friendship by talking about the process of forming friendships. We'll then take our peer conversation and look at larger social groups as well as the culture surrounding youth. So, to start, how do teenagers and emerging adults choose who to be friends with? As we talked about in our last video, similarity is still important. As you can see here with me and my friend Megan, having shared interests, shared passions, and shared pastimes are important. We also tend to befriend people of similar ages and genders as ourselves during this period. Similar educational orientation, where it's not as common to see friends who are half of them in honors classes and half of them not doing so well in school. We tend to pick people who have the same motivation to succeed in school, the same time commitment to our schoolwork, and things along those lines. Media and leisure preference, like I mentioned, tends to still be very important. Things like taste in music, participating in the same sport, and so on and so forth. The last two categories here that I want to talk about are particularly interesting. We tend to choose friends who show the same degree and type of risk behaviors, meaning that teenagers who, let's say, take part in the same drug and alcohol risk behaviors are going to be more likely to befriend one another, while teenagers who abstain from drinking and drugs during high school are more likely to be friends with each other. And then the last category is ethnicity. This is something we see increase a lot during adolescence, when the awareness and importance of ethnicity tends to become more, adolescents tend to become more aware of it. So it tends to become more important for teenagers to have friends who understand their ethnic experience. So that's a trend that starts during adolescence. Doesn't necessarily matter as much during childhood, but we'll start to see this trend become more and more important for friendships as well as picking romantic partners a little bit later on. As I mentioned on the previous slide, risk behaviors are important. And as I said, we tend to choose friends who show the same degree of these behaviors. For that reason, peer pressure, or what more accurately should be described as friend pressure, since we tend to care less about people who aren't our friends, can actually be a good or bad thing, depending on who you're friends with. If you're friends with people who are pressuring you to do better at school, that might actually benefit you. But of course, we all know how peer pressure can be a bad thing. What I want to focus on here is the idea that parents, that adults tend to have, that if your kid gets involved with the wrong group, that can be really bad for them. Parents during adolescence particularly tend to be very aware of who their child is befriending. And they tend to have this idea that, hey, I better keep an eye on that because they're going to lead my child down the wrong path. We do know that there is a correlation between the number of risk behaviors an adolescent takes and their friend group, meaning that we're more likely to show more risky behaviors if our friends are showing more risky behaviors. Part of that does come from influence, my second bullet point here, or peer pressure, okay, where I'm doing it because everyone else is doing it. But a big part of this correlation, remember correlation, not causation, a big part of this relationship is just choosing friends who are already showing those same behaviors, or selective association. People choose friends who are like them. If I'm a smoker, I'm more likely to choose a friend who's also a smoker. If I am a teenager who has decided to, we'll say, wait until marriage to have sex, I'm more likely to choose friends who have made the same decision. So that relationship means that the decisions our children make, our adolescents make, aren't entirely from peer pressure. A lot of the similarities we see here purely come from selective association. Now, that does not mean that it's not possible for a kid to join a friend group who is engaging in much riskier behaviors than they are, and that influence kicks in and they kind of start to go down that path as well, because that definitely happens. I just want to point out here that on average, some self-selection has already happened before that process takes place. Again, both association and influence impact rates of risk behaviors within a specific friend group. Another thing I want to talk about when it comes to creating friendships is the role of support that we offer one another. As we're developing friendships, we tend to rely more and more on one another across many different domains. And I want to take a second and look at those domains because they're particularly important to help us deal with kind of the trials and tribulations that come along with being a teenager. The first one is informational support, where we give each other advice and guidance on how to problem solve, how to shop, how to do makeup, how to play a sport, how to study for your exam. Information is very important. A lot of the experiences we have during high school are new. We're doing things for the first time, and we need people to help guide us. So when you have a friend who's maybe already gone through something you have or knows more about something, that informational support, again, this is coming from someone you really trust and have a lot of intimacy and loyalty with, it's going to be critical. We also see high rates of instrumental support, or helping a friend with a specific task, helping them fix their car, helping them study for a test, helping them practice for football. That's an important friendship activity as well. The same is true for companionship support. And I like to describe this one as that phone call you make to a friend where you ask them, hey, you're going to be at that party, right? Because you don't want to go to the party unless your friend is there. Companionship support is relying on each other for, of course, companionship, but also support during social activities. We still do this as adults, of course, but during adolescence, it tends to be a little bit more important. We're less comfortable, or we tend to be less comfortable doing new or important things by ourselves. So we like to have a high degree of companionship support. And then our last category is esteem support. This is giving congratulations, encouragement, and consolation during particularly exciting or particularly trying times. All of these different sources of support that we get from our friends help us navigate the transition that is high school. Now we want to move a bit away from specific friend pairings and look at social groups on a larger level. As I'm sure many of us are aware, each high school has an intricate breakdown of different groups of people. All of these groups tend to be based on similarity, but depending on the size of the group and the connective tissue holding that group together, we tend to see different levels of intimacy. So, this is a word we might have all heard before, a clique. Yes, that's actually a scientific word from the developmental psychology literature. A clique is a small group of friends, individuals who know each other well, who have a high degree of intimacy, who trust each other, who are loyal to one another, and tend to spend a lot of time together. Within each clique, you likely have many different friendship pairs, friendship triangles, and so on and so forth, but the group as a whole is held together by mutual shared time. Cliques tend to be between 3 and 12 people, and again, we see a high degree of intimacy here. But that's actually not the largest group, or peer group that we see. Crowds are larger groups of typically similar aged peers who we associate together because of shared reputation. These individuals aren't necessarily friends. They aren't necessarily having a high degree of intimacy or even spending a lot of time together. We just associate them with one another because they are all athletes, they are all nerds, they are all druggies, and so on and so forth, to use some of the terms we actually pull from the literature here. So crowds actually tend to have smaller cliques within them. Some of those cliques may associate from time to time, but the key here is that we're seeing reputation-based groups, and these can be very large. Now I want you to once again think back to your high school experience. I'm sure you can all identify a crowd. Crowds might be people who were all invited to this one type of party, but at that party you see the smaller cliques breaking out. You can have people who are mobile between different cliques within a crowd who might be part of multiple cliques. So take an athlete who is also an academic, who might associate with the football team and the baseball team, 2 cliques inside of the athlete's crowd, but they also have cliques of friends within the academic crowd. So these categories aren't set in stone. You can see some degree of fluidity between them. What I want to look at next are some friendship characteristics or relationship characteristics that we tend to see within these groups of people. As you might imagine, or as you might remember, within cliques, we tend to see a large degree of sarcasm and ridicule, teasing each other, making fun of one another. This approach to friendship actually establishes hierarchy and tends to enforce group conformity. The person doing the lion's share of the sarcasm and the ridiculing might be what we call the queen bee, the person with the most power within that specific group. And sarcasm and ridicule are typically used to maintain those characteristics that brought the group together in the first place, where you might tease someone for wearing something outside the norm or participating in some extracurricular activity outside the norm. So these 2 different approaches, which can, of course, be kind of mean, tend to support the way things are within the specific clique. Some of this is what we call relational aggression, where we are harming one another by damaging their reputation. Rumor spreading, excluding, intentionally not including someone in a group text or inviting them to a party, whispering behind their back. Those types of behavior are actually considered aggressive because they're intended to harm another person. We know that both males and females use relational aggression and physical aggression for these purposes. However, physical aggression tends to be more common among boys, while relational aggression tends to be more common among girls. That, of course, does not mean that males don't use relational aggression and females don't use physical aggression, because we definitely see that happening. Now I want to focus specifically on the concept of popularity. Okay? We use a research method here called sociometry. This is a method of assessing popularity within a specific school by having students self-rate who they like and who they dislike. So you'll see a class be handed a roster of everyone in their class. They go through the roster and they check everyone they like and then circle everyone they dislike. So we get data on each student where we track how many people like them and how many people actively dislike them. Popularity is being liked by a lot of people. Someone who's popular tends to be have a desirable physical appearance, yes, but the most important one here tends to be social skills. Popular individuals tend to know how to handle social situations, know how to navigate relationships, and get along well with other people. They also tend to be more intelligent. A controversial individual, however, might also be considered popular, where they have a lot of students reporting that they like them, but they also have a lot of students or classmates reporting that they dislike them. Once again, these controversial peers tend to have a high degree of social skill. They know how to navigate that social world, but they also tend to be more aggressive at the same time, where they're fun but quick to use relational or physical aggression. Typically speaking, controversial students lead groups of deviant or cliques of deviant peers. So what about teens who do not receive a lot of votes of being liked? Unpopular teens who don't get a lot of like votes, tend to be low in social skills. That tends to be the primary difference between popular and unpopular teenagers. One category of unpopular teen that we see is something called a rejected adolescent. Rejected peers are actively disliked. They do not get very many like votes at all and have a lot of students report disliking them. These kids tend to be aggressive. They tend to be disruptive, either in the classroom environment or during social situations, and they also tend to create problems or to be quarrelsome. We also see a category of unpopular teens that we call neglected adolescents. And these teenagers tend to not really get a vote either way. Very few people report liking them, very few people report not liking them. Being neglected actually has some pretty serious consequences, higher rates of depression and anxiety, poorer school performance, and so on and so forth. But what we do know is that even if you are overwhelmingly neglected, if you just have one close friend, it can protect you from all of those negative outcomes. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to be neglected, as long as you have at least one strong friendship to fall back on. The key difference we see between popular and unpopular teens looks like it comes down to how they process social information. I mentioned both of these categories tend to be lower in social skills, but one reason that teenagers typically become disliked is because of the way they interpret other people's behavior. Social information processing is the way that we interpret behavior and intentions of other people. So imagine for a second that you're walking down the hallway and someone bumps into you and your books fall onto the ground. You have two different interpretations of this you can make. They did it on purpose, or it was an accident. There was no malintent there. Rejected teenagers tend to assume negative intentions, okay, and then react to them, which creates these aggressive, disruptive, and quarrelsome behaviors that earn them these negative reputations. So, what can we do to help rejected and neglected or unpopular kids be more liked by their peers? This all comes down to social cognition, how we think and react to social cues. So there's a few guidelines you can follow here. You can teach yourself to, when you're faced with a situation like someone bumping into you in the hallway, to stop, take a second, and calm down before acting. You can then teach yourself to go over the problem, write down how it's making you feel, set some goals for the situation. How do I want the situation to look once we're done? And then to think about possible solutions to accomplish that goal. Well, I don't want this person to go tell the principal on me. That's a negative outcome. In order to do that, I need to make sure that I'm not escalating the situation, even though that's really what I want to do right now. Next, you anticipate consequences of your actions. Well, if I were to yell or shove this person back, that would probably escalate the situation and get me in trouble. So, I need to choose the solution that's going to accomplish my goals. Teaching this type of thought process to an adolescent who is struggling with social skills can really help them overcome the inability to navigate those situations. The last slide that I want to talk about is youth culture. We've talked about friendships, we've talked about hierarchies within adolescent populations, popularity, unpopularity. Another aspect that I want to look at of our peer relationships is the culture or the characteristics that surround groups of adolescents. As you might imagine, adolescence is a very unique time when it comes to culture. How we dress, how we talk, what we watch, what we do, what we're interested in. We know that each kind of generation of youth has their own unique culture. But across history, those cultures tend to resemble each other in some important domains. The first one is something we call subterranean values, the kind of overarching category for all youth cultures is this idea of subterranean values, where teenagers, regardless of what generation you're in or what decade you were a teenager during, tend to emphasize hedonism. Hedonism is this idea that I should behave in a way that brings me pleasure at the expense of everything else. So they focus on hedonism and the drive for excitement and adventure. I want you to think back to what you valued as a teenager, what you think your peers valued as a teenager, and you can likely draw some connections here. The good news here is that this tends to be a pretty temporary state of mind, where once we leave emerging adulthood, those subterranean values tend to become much more mainstream, where we're no longer valuing pleasure and excitement, but rather responsibility and financial security. But Subterranean values do tend to have a few unique characteristics that come along with them, what we call youth styles, features of each youth culture. I know that when I was in high school, we had a specific way of dressing that was popular, specific demeanors, gestures, gaits, or postures that was possible, and of course, a specific way of talking, what we call argot. The same is probably true for when you were a teenager, and you can probably think of what youth style looks like right now. Even though older adults tend to kind of look down on the specific traits of each generation's youth style, the truth is that they all tend to trace back to this idea of subterranean values, where we're just kind of reinventing the wheel every time a new generation comes along. The peers we interact with, the people we choose to befriend, help shape these cultures for us. But we tend to see some big consistencies across people who are of a shared generation during their adolescent experiences. So, if you're someone who doesn't have a lot of experience with adolescence right now, I encourage you to maybe get on TikTok if you're comfortable using that social platform. Watch how people are dressing. Watch how they talk to each other, how they hold their posture, how they walk. And you'll likely notice trends that are popular across different states or even different countries. They all trace back to this shared style of youth. Once you make those observations, I want you to think back to your own experience as a high school student and look for some similarities, because I bet you will find, even though the clothes look a little different, they're all trying to accomplish some of the same things. That's all I have for Chapter 8. As always, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions.